Welcome to the 92nd Henry George week daily devotional, but it's a strong daily devotional. We are in chapter 9, the application of the remedy or something. Oh, just effects of the remedy. And we are in chapter 2 now, as you can see on the screen. Of the effect upon distribution and thence upon production, not construction. Ooh, it's pretty long, but not too long. We'll see. Let's do it. But great as they thus appear, and I do want to remind anybody who's in the Southern California, LA area that this Saturday we are having a Georgist meetup, and it will be in San Pedro at Brewery West on Saturday, 2 p.m. But great as they thus appear, the advantages of a transference of all public burdens to a tax upon the value of land cannot be fully appreciated until we consider the effect upon the distribution of wealth. We just got done talking about how a land value tax is going to unencumber the economy, and now he says we have to think about how the distribution of wealth will be affected. Tracing out the cause of the unequal distribution of wealth, which appears in all civilized countries, with a constant tendency to greater and greater inequality as material progress goes on, we have found it in the fact that as civilization advances, the ownership of land now in private hands gives a greater and greater power of appropriating the wealth produced by labor and capital. I would add to this that I think IP rights, proprietary software and patenting has also entrenched all of big tech, all of big pharma, and patent is a form of monopoly, artificial monopoly granted by the government. Thus, to relieve labor and capital from all taxation, direct and indirect, and to throw the burden upon rent would be, as far as it went, to counteract this tendency to inequality. If the inequality is a result of land ownership without a land value tax, then this would counteract it. And if it went so far as to take in taxation the whole of rent, the cause of inequality would be totally destroyed. That's a little exaggerating, a little hyperbolic. There's still always a natural inequality between people, but I think he talks about this a lot more. Rent, instead of causing inequality as now, would then promote equality. Yes, because it would fall more heavily on those with the more precious land. Labor and capital would then receive the whole produce minus that portion taken by the state in the taxation of land values, which, being applied to public purposes, would be equally distributed in public benefits. That is to say, the wealth produced in every community would be divided into trois portions. One portion would be distributed in wages and interest between individual producers, according to the part each had taken in the work of production. Yes. The other part, the rent, would go to the community as a whole to be distributed in public benefits to all its members. And this all would share equally, the weak with the strong, young children and decrepit old men, the maimed, the halt, I wonder what that means, and the blind, as well as the vigorous. And justly so. For while one part represents the result of individual effort in production, the other represents the increased power with which the community as a whole aids the individual. Yeah, it's interesting. I read a quote from Benjamin Franklin the other day, who was justifying any form of taxation because the currency belongs to the government. Um, and that's such a weird technical, like, oh, uh, your dollar bills and your coins were minted by the government so they can take them back if they want them. So then it's like, shit, don't have currency then. Like, what's the justification if somebody then just doesn't use currency and just has just a bunch of Georgian wealth and not currency? Anyway, uh, I think Franklin got that one wrong. Thus, as material progress tends to increase rent, were rent taken by the community for common purposes, the very cause which now tends to produce inequality as material progress goes on, it would then tend to produce greater and greater equality. Fully to understand this effect, let us revert to principles previously worked out. We're going through it again. Here we go. We have seen that wages and interest must everywhere be fixed by the rent line or margin of cultivation, that is to say, by the reward which labor and capital can secure on land that's free, for which no rent is paid. So the rent line, margin of cultivation, is determined, I'm just repeating this, it's determined by the free land available. That the aggregate amount of wealth which the aggregate of labor and capital employed in production will receive. It will be the amount of wealth produced, or rather, when we consider taxes, the net amount minus what is taken as rent. So if there are no taxes on labor and capital, it will just be the amount of wealth produced minus rent. But if there are taxes on wealth or on labor and capital, then it would be less, even less. We have seen that with material progress, as it is, this is simply that same, production equals wages, interest, and rent. Wages plus interest plus rent. Excuse me. We have seen that with material progress, as it is at present going on, there is a twofold tendency to the advance of rent. Both are to the increase of the proportion of the wealth produced which goes as rent, and to the decrease of the proportion which goes as wages and interest. But the first or natural tendency which results from the laws of social development is to the increase of rent as a quantity, without the reduction of wages and interest as quantities, or even with their quantitative increase. The other tendency which results from the unnatural appropriation of land to private ownership is to the increase of rent as a quantity by the reduction of wages and interest as quantities. Now it is evident that to take rent in taxation for public purposes, not purchases, it is evident to take rent in taxation for public purposes, which virtually abolishes private ownership in land, would be to destroy the tendency to an absolute decrease in wages and interest by destroying the speculative monopolization on land and the speculative increase in rent. So, saying this backwards, by destroying land speculation and the corresponding rent it gathers, we will virtually abolish land monopoly, private ownership in land, and we would destroy how the tendency of wages and interest to decrease. So wages and interest would no longer decrease as progress and land values went up. If we were to take rent and taxation for public purposes, it would be very largely to increase wages and interest by throwing open natural opportunities now monopolized, and reducing the price of land. Now, of course, in Georgia's time, there was no zoning. We still have to contend with zoning. I think if we didn't have zoning, you would see a combination probably of more empty lots and more like super slum housing, high density-ish stuff. Pottersvilles. Um, so there still would be sprawl. I don't know if it would be greater or less than the sprawl that has resulted from the combination of zoning plus uh, land monopoly. I wonder if how the zoning as a band-aid, is it? I mean, I'm so used to just hating zoning. But if you have to live in a land monopoly world, I don't know. I think zoning still seems pretty bad, or at least the zoning we've done. But my common response to people who just want to upzone and don't know about LVT, or maybe they're just not, they don't believe in it, is that we are simply opening, or we're simply going to start developing slums over time. Because you invite slumlordism, you invite land speculation, they won't want to build anything. As long as some people are willing to build a little bit, a bunch of other people will just buy a bunch of land and do the absolute minimum required by government to maintain possession. And, if they have slums or parking lots, they don't care as long as their property tax is super low, and then they can get a return through the land value. Anyway, zoning. If only we had George with us now to tear apart zoning. But we don't need him. We know the problem. By throwing, oh yeah, so the other comment, like if we were to abolish zoning, have the LVT, there's so much land we could reclaim for as green space. We could live densely but more happily. We could not pollute our environment as much. We could live more sustainably while also increasing everybody's wealth. Because you know, I don't think there's a strong desire of people to particularly drive in vehicles that poison the world. Anyway, throwing open natural opportunities that are now monopolized and reducing the price of land. Labor and capital would thus not merely gain what is now taken from them in taxation, but would gain by the positive decline in rent. What a funny way of putting it. They would gain by the decline in rent caused by the decrease in speculative land values. Yes, there would be no more speculation. Rent would go down, he says. Well, at least it would in some areas. A new equilibrium would be established at which the common rate of wages and interest would be much higher than now. Yeah, I don't think George talked too much about this point, about wages going up, because it takes several steps to get there when discussing it, and it takes an acceptance of like a few premises. But I do think this is one of the most compelling reasons. Which is returning to the laborer their just reward. and returning to the person who labors and stores it up as capital to produce more wealth, their just reward. It's weird to think of capital not getting its just reward, but I think that's because in our perspective now, we conflate capitalists with landowners all the time. Um, anyway, this is seen when you look at, uh, I honestly like when you're buying and selling a house, over time the house decays, but we think of the house appreciating in value because it's completely the value of the land that's going up. Um, but this new equilibrium established further advances in productive power, and the tendency in this direction would be greatly accelerated, would result in still increasing rent, not at the expense of wages and interest, but by new gains in production, which, as rent would be taken by the community for public uses, would accrue to the advantage of every member of the community. Thus, as material progress went on, the condition of the masses would constantly improve. Not merely one class would become richer, but all would become richer. Not merely one class would have more of the necessaries, conveniences, and elegancies of life, but all would have more. For the increasing power of production which comes with increasing population, with every new discovery in the productive arts, with every labor-saving invention, with every extension and facilitation of exchanges, could be monopolized by none. That part of the benefit which did not go directly to increase the reward of labor and capital would go to the state, that is to say, to the whole community, with all the enormous advantages, material and mental, of a dense population. Would be united the freedom and equality that can now be found only in new and sparsely settled districts. All right, that's a pretty exciting way to conclude, and so I shall. See you next time.